The calm before the storm. In the closing months of World War II, as the smoke cleared across Europe, a fragile silence settled over the world. The Allies had triumphed over Nazi Germany, but beneath the surface, a new power struggle was brewing. The United States and the Soviet Union, once uneasy allies, were already eyeing each other with suspicion. Each knew the other wanted to shape the post-war world in its own image. When the guns fell silent, in 1945, victory didn't bring unity, it brought division. Europe was shattered, desperate for stability. But while the U.S. sought democracy and open markets, the USSR demanded security and communist influence over its neighbors. Between those competing visions, a secret agreement was forming, one that would quietly redraw borders and loyalties for decades to come. The seeds of the Cold War were planted long before the war even ended. During conferences like Tehran and Yalta, U.S. President Franklin Roosevelt, British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, and Soviet Premier Joseph Stalin discussed how to handle post-war Europe. But every handshake hid a shadow. Each side made promises it never planned to keep. At Yalta, in February 1945, the three leaders sat together in a frozen Crimean resort. They agreed on the liberation of Europe, the division. Few knew that at Yalta, Stalin and Churchill reached an informal understanding, often called the Percentages Agreement. On a scrap of paper, they divided Eastern Europe into zones of influence. Romania, 90% Soviet. Greece, 90% British. Yugoslavia, Hungary, and Bulgaria shared control. It was a cynical but pragmatic deal, a secret treaty that would haunt the future. President Roosevelt knew of this deal, but hoped the alliance could survive. He believed cooperation with Stalin could preserve peace. But Stalin saw Yalta differently, not as cooperation, but as a license to dominate Eastern Europe. That misinterpretation set the stage for confrontation. Churchill later called the Percentages Agreement a moment of moral weakness. He knew he had traded away the freedom of millions to buy temporary stability. But Britain was exhausted, and he feared Soviet troops would march further west if he didn't make concessions. For Stalin, the agreement was a strategic victory. The USSR had lost more than 20 million lives, and he intended to create a buffer zone of communist states to prevent any future invasions. Every decision he made from then on, occupation, censorship, control, flowed from this vision. As Soviet troops liberated Eastern Europe, they installed puppet governments loyal to Moscow. In Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, and Romania, democracy was crushed before it could even breathe. Stalin's secret deal was no longer hidden. It was unfolding in plain sight. When American diplomats saw Soviet influence spreading, alarm bells rang. What had been seen as wartime cooperation now looked like creeping domination. The United States began to realize that Stalin's promises at Yalta were empty. In 1946, Churchill delivered his famous Iron Curtain speech in Fulton, Missouri. He declared that an Iron Curtain had descended across Europe, dividing free nations from those under Soviet control. The world now had a name for the invisible line the secret treaty had drawn. When Harry Truman succeeded Roosevelt, his approach was far less trusting. He saw Stalin's moves not as defensive, but as expansionist. Truman's administration began shaping policies to contain Soviet power, what became known as the Truman Doctrine. Berlin became the first battleground of this new conflict. Though divided into Allied sectors, the city was deep inside Soviet-controlled territory. The Soviets blockaded Berlin in 1948, trying to force the West out. But instead, the U.S. responded with the Berlin airlift, keeping the city supplied from the sky. By 1949, the distrust solidified into alliances. The U.S. and Western Europe formed NATO, a military pact to counter Soviet aggression. In response, the Soviets later created the Warsaw Pact, formalizing the division of Europe that the secret Yalta agreements had set in motion. The secret treaty didn't just divide land, it divided ideology and technology. In 1949, the Soviets successfully tested their first atomic bomb, ending America's monopoly on nuclear power. The arms race had begun. Historians later discovered that even within the Allies, distrust ran deep. U.S. intelligence suspected Soviet spies had infiltrated atomic research programs, an accusation that proved true with cases like the Rosenbergs and Klaus Fuchs. That single sheet of paper with Churchill's handwritten percentages was quietly tucked away for decades. It wasn't declassified until years later, when historians realized its enormous historical weight. It wasn't a treaty in the legal sense, but it shaped global politics more than many formal ones ever did. For millions living behind the Iron Curtain, the effects of that secret understanding were devastating. Freedoms vanished. Dissenters disappeared. Families were torn apart by political walls, both physical and ideological. The US and USSR didn't just compete militarily, they fought with information. Each side painted the other as evil, spreading fear and nationalism. The world's first global propaganda war had begun. With mistrust at an all-time high, both nations built vast intelligence networks. The CIA and KGB became symbols of the Cold War's silent battles, spies, double agents, and secret missions defining the next 4 decades. The Korean War. In 1950, the ideological divide turned violent in Korea. The North, backed by the USSR and China, invaded the South, supported by the US. The war ended in stalemate, but it proved that the Cold War's secret tensions could explode into open conflict. By the early 1950s, Stalin's paranoia reached new heights. He tightened control over Eastern Europe and purged his own government. The seeds of fear sown by the secret agreement had now become a forest of repression. Stalin's death in 1953 didn't end the tension, it only shifted it. His successors promised reforms but kept the same iron grip. The world watched, unsure whether peace or more confrontation would follow. U.S. President Dwight Eisenhower tried to reduce tensions through diplomacy, but distrust ran too deep. Each side built more weapons, more walls, and more lies. The ghost of Yalta lingered over every negotiation. In 1957, the USSR launched Sputnik, the first artificial satellite. It wasn't just a scientific triumph, it was a geopolitical message. Whoever ruled space could rule the world. By 1961, the division of Europe became concrete, literally. The Berlin Wall went up overnight, symbolizing the divide that had started with that secret paper 16 years earlier. The world came to the brink of nuclear war in 1962, when the USSR placed missiles in Cuba. The crisis ended peacefully, but it showed just how far the Cold War's secret origins had spiraled. By the 1970s, nearly every nation had chosen a side, either aligned with the US-led West or the Soviet-led East. The world map had become a chessboard, each move shadowed by the decisions made at Yalta. The USSR openly declared that it had the right to intervene in any socialist country to maintain communist rule. The hidden understanding from the war had now evolved into official policy. For a brief period, the US and USSR eased tensions. Treaties limited nuclear weapons, and leaders even shook hands. But beneath the smiles, the competition never stopped. It merely adapted. In 1979, the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan marked the final echo of Yalta's shadow. The US armed local fighters in response, and the Cold War entered its bloodiest proxy phase. In the 1980s, U.S. President Ronald Reagan reignited confrontation, calling the USSR the evil empire. He pushed for military buildup and technological superiority, accelerating the Soviet Union's decline. By the late 1980s, communist economies were failing, and people across Eastern Europe began demanding freedom. The secret zones of influence were collapsing from within. In 1989, the Berlin Wall fell. It was the symbolic death of the Cold War and the final undoing of the deal that began it. The people of Eastern Europe reclaimed their freedom. By 1991, the USSR itself dissolved. The empire, built on secrecy and control, crumbled, leaving behind 15 independent nations and a world forever changed. The long shadow. Even today, the echoes of that secret treaty remain. NATO's borders, Russia's mistrust of the West, and the division of influence still shape geopolitics. When documents were finally released, historians confirmed what many suspected, that the Cold War wasn't an accident. It was born from deliberate, secret deals made by tired men in a desperate time. Was Churchill's decision justified? Should Roosevelt have resisted more? History still debates whether the percentages agreement was pragmatic diplomacy or a betrayal of freedom. The story of that hidden deal reminds us that peace built on secrecy rarely lasts. Every backroom agreement carries consequences beyond imagination. One small piece of paper, signed in a smoky room, shaped half a century of global fear, division, and tension. The Cold War didn't start with bombs. It started with a pen. After the Soviet Union's collapse, the world briefly believed in a unipolar moment. The United States stood alone as a superpower. Yet this imbalance carried its own dangers. Former Soviet republics faced chaos, economic collapse, and power struggles, while Russia vowed it would one day rise again. Without the Cold War's clear divide, smaller regional wars erupted across the globe. From the Balkans to the Middle East, old ethnic tensions resurfaced, and new powers began to emerge. The world learned that even without ideological blocks, division was still deeply human. In the 2000s, Russia began to reclaim its strength under new leadership, promising to restore pride and stability. Moscow reasserted control over its vast resources and influence in neighboring states. The dream of regaining lost prestige, born in the ashes of the Soviet Empire, was quietly rekindled. Meanwhile, the West moved east. Former Soviet satellite nations joined NATO and the European Union, seeking protection from the shadow of Moscow. To Russia, it felt like betrayal, a continuation of the encirclement that began decades earlier. To the West, it was the fulfillment of freedom's promise. By the 2010s, relations between Russia and the West began to freeze once more. Cyber warfare replaced spies in trench coats. Disinformation replaced leaflets. The battlefield had changed, but the mistrust remained exactly the same. Beyond Europe, new rivalries began to mirror the old Cold War structure. China's rapid rise challenged American dominance, creating new lines of influence and suspicion. Once again, the world found itself split. Only this time, the players had multiplied. Historians warn that the mistakes of the past are resurfacing. Secret negotiations, proxy wars, and economic coercion, all the same tools once used during the Cold War, are returning under new names. The lessons of Yalta risk being forgotten. In the digital age, walls no longer divide cities, they divide information. Firewalls, censorship, and propaganda networks have replaced barbed wire. The modern Iron Curtain isn't made of concrete, but of code and control. Even today, leaders reference that old wartime agreement, sometimes openly, sometimes indirectly. The fear of encirclement, the desire for dominance, and the mistrust between East and West are all echoes of decisions made in 1945. The secret treaty may be gone, but its ghost remain. The story ends where it began, with a fragile peace. The world stands once again at a crossroads, divided by ideology, ambition, and fear. If history teaches anything, it's this: when power is divided in secret, the world pays in the open. The scrap of paper that once shaped the 20th century still whispers a warning to the 21st. The modern battlefield no longer lies on open ground. It hides in data streams, satellites, and coded networks. Nations now wage war through economics, technology, and influence. Hackers replace soldiers. Algorithms replace propaganda posters. The Cold War never truly ended. It simply changed its weapons. Global alliances are shifting once again. Superpowers build competing trade blocs, militaries, and digital ecosystems. Nations that once sought neutrality are now pressured to choose sides. The old East-West divide has become a complex web, proof that history's divisions never vanish, only evolve. From podiums and parliaments, echoes of the past resurface. Leaders speak of containment, spheres of influence, and defense against aggression. Phrases long buried but never forgotten. The language of the Cold War breathes again, as if that hidden scrap of paper still dictates the rhythm of global politics. Historians and diplomats now revisit the Yalta archives, searching for answers and warnings. They realize that every modern tension, every flashpoint from Eastern Europe to the Pacific, traces its lineage to those smoky rooms of 1945. The ghosts of Yalta linger not in the documents, but in the choices nations keep repeating. Decades have passed, borders have shifted, and leaders have changed. But the game remains the same. Power, fear, and secrecy still shape the world's destiny. The secret treaty may have ended, but its story is humanity's oldest lesson. When peace is written in ink instead of trust, history always finds a way to reopen the file.